young woman kneels at a grave, overcome by guilt and grief. But just as she's about to leave, a man appears through the mist. He's a detective, and what he tells her changes everything she thought she knew about the woman buried there. What secret bound them together, and what truth got someone killed? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The autumn rain fell steadily over Boston, turning the cobblestone streets into mirrors that reflected the gas lamps flickering to life as dusk approached. The year was 1897, and the city wore its Victorian elegance like a well-tailored coat, with brick buildings standing tall against the gray sky and horse-drawn carriages splashing through puddles as they made their way through the bustling streets. Eleanor Whitmore pulled her dark green cloak tighter around her shoulders as she walked through the iron gates of Mount Auburn Cemetery. At 24 years old, she possessed a delicate beauty that turned heads wherever she went. With auburn hair that caught the light even on the gloomiest days, pale skin that seemed almost luminous, and eyes the color of deep forest moss. Her features were refined and gentle, giving her an air of both fragility and quiet strength that made people want to protect her, even as they sensed an inner resilience that belied her soft appearance. In her gloved hands she carried a small bouquet of white roses, their petals dotted with raindrops. She had been coming to this cemetery every Tuesday and Friday for the past 3 months, always to the same grave, always with the same flowers. The headstone read, Elizabeth Ann Brennan, 1869 to 1897, beloved wife and daughter. Eleanor knelt beside the grave, her skirts spreading around her on the damp grass, and carefully placed the roses against the marble marker. I hope you're at peace, she whispered softly, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain on the leaves of the oak trees surrounding the cemetery. I'm so sorry for what happened. If only I had known sooner, if only I had understood what you were trying to tell me that day. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she remembered the last time she had seen Elizabeth alive. It had been at Mrs. Henderson's tea social, just 6 weeks before Elizabeth's sudden death. Elizabeth had seemed distressed, had pulled Eleanor aside and spoken in urgent, hushed tones about something she needed to discuss, something important. But they had been interrupted, and Elizabeth had made Eleanor promise to meet her the following week. That meeting never happened. 3 days later, Elizabeth was found dead in her home, the official cause listed as heart failure, though she had been perfectly healthy and only 28 years old. Eleanor had been plagued by guilt ever since. What had Elizabeth wanted to tell her? Could it have saved her life? The two women hadn't been close friends, but they had known each other through various social circles, and Elizabeth had always been kind to Eleanor, offering advice and encouragement when Eleanor had first arrived in Boston from her family's small farm in Vermont 2 years earlier, seeking work as a governess. As Eleanor stood to leave, wiping the tears from her cheeks, she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned to see a tall figure approaching through the mist and rain. The man was imposing in stature, easily over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark wool coat impressively. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out his features more clearly. Strong, chiseled features with a square jaw, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything, and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his black hat. He appeared to be in his early 30s, and there was something both commanding and deeply sorrowful in his bearing. He stopped a few feet from Eleanor, his eyes moving from her face to the grave at her feet, then back to her face. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, with a slight roughness that suggested either emotion or exhaustion. "Excuse me, miss," he said, removing his hat respectfully despite the rain. "I don't mean to startle you, but I've noticed you here before. Several times, in fact." He paused, his jaw tightening. "That's my wife's grave." Eleanor felt the color drain from her face. Her heart began to pound, and she took an involuntary step backward. I'm so sorry," she stammered, clutching her small purse to her chest. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I should go." "Wait," the man said, holding up one hand. His expression softened slightly, though the pain in his eyes remained evident. "Please, I'm not angry. I'm just curious. My name is Detective James Brennan, and I'd very much like to know why you've been visiting my wife's grave twice a week for the past 3 months. Eleanor's mind raced. She had never considered that Elizabeth's husband might notice her visits, might question them, She had acted purely on impulse, driven by guilt and a desperate need to honor the woman who had tried to reach out to her in what might have been her final days. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said quietly, finding her voice despite her nervousness. "I knew your wife, Mr. Brennan. Not well, but we had met several times at social gatherings. She was very kind to me when I first came to Boston. I feel responsible in a way for her death." Detective Brennan's expression shifted from curiosity to intense scrutiny. He took a step closer, his blue eyes searching Eleanor's face. "Responsible? What do you mean by that, Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor felt trapped by his gaze, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. There was intelligence there, and pain, but also a desperate hunger for answers that she recognized all too well. She had seen it in her own reflection every day since Elizabeth's death. "Perhaps we should speak somewhere more private," Eleanor suggested, glancing around the cemetery. The rain was falling harder now, and she was beginning to shiver despite her cloak. "Somewhere dry, where we can talk properly." Detective Brennan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "There's a small tea room on Beacon Street just outside the cemetery gates. Morrison's. Do you know it?" "I do," Eleanor replied. "Then let's go there now," he said, replacing his hat and offering his arm. "I have many questions for you, Miss Whitmore, and something tells me you might have answers I've been searching for." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his arm. Even through the layers of fabric, she could feel the strength in his muscles, the solidity of his presence. As they walked together through the cemetery gates and onto the street, she couldn't help but notice how he shortened his stride to match hers, how he positioned himself between her and the splashing wheels of passing carriages, protecting her from the spray. Morrison's tea room was a cozy establishment with warm yellow light spilling from its windows onto the rain-slicked street. Inside, the air was fragrant with the scent of fresh bread and brewing tea. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and small tables covered in white linen were scattered throughout the room. Most were occupied by ladies taking their afternoon refreshment, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum of background noise. Detective Brennan guided Eleanor to a corner table, away from the other patrons, where they might speak with some privacy. He helped her remove her damp cloak before taking his own coat off and hanging both on the nearby stand. As they sat down, Eleanor couldn't help but notice the way other women in the tea room glanced at him with interest, then at her with something that might have been envy. He was, she had to admit, extraordinarily handsome, though the grief that shadowed his features made him seem somehow untouchable, as if he existed behind a wall of sorrow that kept the world at bay. A waitress appeared, and Detective Brennan ordered tea and scones for both of them without asking Eleanor's preference. Under other circumstances, she might have been annoyed by the presumption, but she sensed he was acting on autopilot, his mind already focused on the questions he needed to ask. Once the waitress had departed, he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table between them. "Now, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and intense, "please tell me everything. Why do you feel responsible for Elizabeth's death?" Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. 3 days before she died, I saw your wife at Mrs. Henderson's tea social. She seemed troubled, agitated even. She pulled me aside and told me she needed to speak with me urgently, that she had discovered something important, something dangerous. But we were interrupted before she could explain further, and she made me promise to meet her the following Tuesday at the public garden, by the pond. Detective Brennan's expression had grown even more intent, if that were possible. He didn't interrupt, but Eleanor could see his hands tightening where they lay on the table. "I agreed, of course," Eleanor continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But when Tuesday came, I received word that Elizabeth had died. Heart failure, they said. I went to the funeral, but I felt like a fraud being there among her real friends and family, knowing that she had tried to confide in me and I had failed her. What if what she wanted to tell me could have saved her life? What if her death wasn't natural at all?" "Go on," Detective Brennan urged, his voice rough. "Since then I haven't been able to stop thinking about it," Eleanor admitted. "I bring flowers to her grave because it's the only thing I can do, the only way I can honor her memory and apologize for not being there when she needed me." Detective Brennan was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Elizabeth didn't die of heart failure, Miss Whitmore. At least I don't believe she did. She was healthy, vibrant, full of life one day and gone the next. The doctor said it was her heart, but there were no warning signs, no previous symptoms. I'm a detective, Miss Whitmore. I've investigated dozens of suspicious deaths, and my own wife's death has all the hallmarks of something far more sinister than natural causes." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with her damp clothing. "You think she was murdered?" "I do," he said flatly. "But I have no proof, and no one will listen to me. They think I'm a grieving husband who can't accept the truth. But I know Elizabeth, knew her better than anyone, and she was hiding something in those final weeks. She was frightened, though she tried to hide it from me. She would startle at sudden noises, check over her shoulder when we walked together. I asked her what was wrong, but she wouldn't tell me. She said she needed to be certain before she involved me, that she didn't want to put me in danger." The tea room seemed to fade away as Eleanor absorbed Detective Brennan's words. The revelation that he shared her suspicions about Elizabeth's death sent a mixture of validation and dread through her. She watched as the waitress returned with their tea service, setting down a delicate porcelain pot, matching cups, and a plate of warm scones with jam and clotted cream. Neither of them moved to pour the tea. "Mr. Brennan," Eleanor said softly, leaning forward so their conversation wouldn't carry to nearby tables. "If you truly believe your wife was murdered, then what she wanted to tell me might be the key to understanding why. Perhaps she had discovered something about whoever killed her, and she wanted to confide in someone outside her immediate circle, someone who wouldn't be suspected of knowing anything." James Brennan's blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That's precisely what I've been thinking since I first noticed you at the cemetery. I had you investigated, Miss Whitmore. Forgive me, but I'm a detective and I needed to know who was visiting my wife's grave so faithfully." Eleanor felt a flutter of both alarm and strange flattery at this admission. "What did you discover?" "That you're exactly who you claim to be," he replied, a hint of respect entering his voice. "Eleanor Jane Whitmore, 24 years old, from a farming family in Vermont. You came to Boston 2 years ago seeking employment and have been working as a governess for the Pembroke family on Commonwealth Avenue. You're known for your kindness, your intelligence, and your impeccable character. You have no debts, no scandals, and no apparent reason to wish harm to anyone." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at this recitation of her life. It was unsettling to know she had been investigated, yet she understood his reasoning. "Then you know I'm telling you the truth." "I do," he said, finally reaching for the teapot and pouring for both of them with steady hands. "Which is why I'm going to share something with you that I haven't told anyone else. 3 weeks before Elizabeth died, I found a letter in her writing desk. She had hidden it beneath the false bottom, the kind of hiding place she thought I didn't know about." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed slightly with age. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as he unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. Eleanor could see Elizabeth's elegant handwriting covering the page. "May I?" she asked, and at his nod, she picked up the letter and began to read. The letter was addressed to no one, written as if Elizabeth had been organizing her thoughts on paper. It spoke of suspicions she had developed about certain financial irregularities at the Boston Maritime Trust, where her father, Harrison Fletcher, served as vice president. Elizabeth had noticed discrepancies in the accounts, money that seemed to disappear and reappear in ways that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than clerical error. She had begun to investigate quietly, not wanting to accuse anyone without proof, but the more she discovered, the more certain she became that someone at the bank was embezzling substantial sums. "This is extraordinary," Eleanor breathed, looking up at James. "Did you investigate the bank?" His jaw tightened. "I tried, but Harrison Fletcher is one of the most powerful men in Boston. When I approached him with questions about the bank's finances, he had me removed from the case immediately. He claimed I was delusional with grief, seeing conspiracies where none existed. He had enough influence to have me officially warned by my superiors to drop the matter entirely. But surely if there's evidence of embezzlement—" "There's no evidence anymore," James interrupted bitterly. "If there ever was, it's been destroyed or hidden so well that no one will find it without access to the bank's inner records. And I have no authority to demand such access, not without substantial proof of wrongdoing, which I don't have." Eleanor set down the letter carefully, her mind working through the implications. "Your wife's father works at the very bank she suspected of corruption. Do you think he could be involved?" James's expression grew pained. "Harrison Fletcher loved his daughter more than anything in this world. I can't believe he would harm her, even to protect himself. But someone at that bank discovered what Elizabeth was investigating, and I believe they killed her to keep her silent." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation and grief. Eleanor found herself studying James Brennan more carefully. Despite his imposing physical presence, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that touched something deep within her. Here was a man who had lost everything, who was fighting alone against powerful forces, desperate for justice for the woman he had loved. "How did she die, exactly?" Eleanor asked gently. "What were the circumstances?" James took a long breath before answering, and Eleanor could see the effort it cost him to revisit these painful details. Elizabeth had spent the afternoon with friends. She returned home around 6 in the evening, seemed perfectly well. We had dinner together, discussed our plans for the following week. She mentioned she had an appointment the next day, but didn't say with whom. After dinner, she retired to her sitting room to read, while I worked on some case files in my study. He paused to take a sip of his tea, though Eleanor suspected it was more to steady himself than from actual thirst. Around 9 o'clock, I heard a crash from her room. I ran upstairs and found her collapsed on the floor, her book fallen beside her. She was gasping for air, her face was pale, and she was clutching her chest. I sent our housekeeper running for the doctor, but by the time he arrived, 15 minutes later, Elizabeth was gone. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry." The doctor examined her and declared it heart failure. James continued, his voice now flat and emotionless, as if he had distanced himself from the memory to bear its telling. He saw no reason to suspect anything else. Elizabeth was taken away, and 2 days later she was buried. It wasn't until afterward, when I was going through her things, that I found the letter and began to piece together what she had been investigating. "Was there anything else unusual that evening?" Eleanor pressed. "Anything at all that seemed out of place?" James's eyes sharpened. "There was one thing. Elizabeth had been drinking tea when I found her. The cup was still on the table beside her chair, half full. I was so distraught that I didn't think anything of it at the time, but later I remembered that the tea had a strange smell, slightly bitter, almost medicinal. By the time I thought to have it tested, the housekeeper had already cleaned the room thoroughly, and the cup had been washed." "Poison," Eleanor whispered. "You think she was poisoned?" "I do," James confirmed. "But without evidence, without the cup or its contents, I can't prove anything. And even if I could, who would believe that someone poisoned her in her own home? Our staff had been with us for years, all of them loyal and trustworthy. There were no visitors that evening, no strangers who could have tampered with her tea." Eleanor's mind raced through the possibilities. Unless the poison wasn't in the tea itself, but in something else. Or unless it was administered earlier in the day and simply took hours to take effect. James leaned back in his chair, regarding her with new appreciation. "You have a detective's mind, Miss Whitmore. Those are exactly the conclusions I've reached. But again, without evidence, they remain merely theories. Then we need to find evidence," Eleanor said firmly, surprising herself with her own boldness. "Mr. Brennan, your wife tried to reach out to me before she died. Perhaps there's a reason for that, something that connects us beyond mere acquaintance. If you're willing, I would like to help you investigate her death and uncover the truth about what she discovered at the bank." James studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from his penetrating gaze. She could see him weighing the risks, considering whether to involve her further in what was clearly a dangerous situation. "It could be perilous," he finally said. "If Elizabeth was murdered for what she knew, then anyone who investigates her death could be in danger as well." "I understand," Eleanor replied steadily, "but I've been carrying guilt over her death for 3 months now. If there's any chance I can help bring her killer to justice, I have to take it. Besides, I'm just a governess. No one would suspect me of investigating anything." A slight smile, the first she had seen from him, touched James's lips. "That's actually an excellent point. You could move through certain social circles without arousing suspicion, ask questions that I cannot." The smile faded. "But I couldn't forgive myself if something happened to you because I involved you in this." "You're not involving me," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm choosing to involve myself. Your wife reached out to me for help, and I failed her then. I won't fail her again." James was quiet for a moment longer. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Whitmore. But we must be extremely careful. Whoever killed Elizabeth is cunning and ruthless. They've already gotten away with murder once, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they feel threatened." "Where do we start?" Eleanor asked, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation coursing through her. "We start by reconstructing Elizabeth's final days," James said. his detective's mind clearly already formulating a plan. "You said she spoke to you at Mrs. Henderson's tea social 3 days before she died. I need you to tell me everything you can remember about that conversation, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Then we'll need to trace her movements during those 3 days, find out where she went, who she spoke with, and what she might have discovered." Eleanor nodded, closing her eyes to better recall that afternoon. "She approached me during a lull in the conversations. We had stepped out onto the terrace because the parlor was quite warm. She seemed nervous, kept glancing over her shoulder. She told me she had discovered something troubling, something that involved people in positions of trust and authority. She said she needed to speak with someone who wasn't connected to her usual circles, someone who could be objective." "Did she mention any names?" James asked urgently. "No specific names," Eleanor replied, frowning with concentration. "But she did say something odd. She said that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who betray us most deeply, and that appearances of respectability could hide the darkest sins. She seemed particularly agitated when she mentioned that fortunes built on the suffering of others would eventually crumble." James's expression had grown increasingly troubled. That sounds like she had discovered something specific, perhaps evidence of how the embezzled money was being used or where it was going. "There's more," Eleanor added, opening her eyes. "Just as she was about to tell me more, we were interrupted by a gentleman. He had come out onto the terrace and seemed surprised to find us there. Elizabeth's entire demeanor changed when she saw him. She became suddenly cheerful and casual, as if our conversation had been about nothing more serious than the weather. She introduced him as Mr. Edmund Price, a colleague of her father's from the bank." James's hand tightened around his teacup so forcefully that Eleanor feared it might shatter. "Edmund Price," he repeated, his voice hard. "Assistant manager at the Boston Maritime Trust. I've met him several times. A smooth-talking man, always impeccably dressed, with the kind of charm that puts people at ease even as it masks whatever he's truly thinking." "You suspect him?" Eleanor asked. "I suspect everyone connected to that bank," James replied grimly. "But Price is particularly interesting because he would have access to the financial records Elizabeth was investigating, and he certainly has the intelligence to orchestrate an embezzlement scheme. Did he say anything significant when he joined you?" Eleanor thought back carefully. "He made pleasant conversation, asked about my position with the Pembroke family, complimented Elizabeth on her dress. But there was something in the way he looked at her, a certain intensity that seemed at odds with his casual words. And Elizabeth, for all her forced cheerfulness, seemed deeply uncomfortable in his presence. As soon as politeness allowed, she excused herself and went back inside. I didn't have another opportunity to speak with her privately that day." James set down his teacup with deliberate care, his detective's mind clearly processing this new information. The rain continued to patter against the tea-room windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy around their corner table. Eleanor noticed how the soft lamplight played across his strong features, softening the hard edges of grief and determination that defined his expression. "Edmund Price," James murmured, almost to himself. If he suspected Elizabeth was investigating the bank's finances, he would have had motive to silence her, and he would have had opportunity as well. He moves in the same social circles, could have access to her home through legitimate visits. But how would he have poisoned her? Eleanor asked. "You said there were no visitors that evening, and your staff is trustworthy." "That's what I need to determine," James replied, his blue eyes meeting hers with renewed intensity. "Miss Whitmore, I know this is asking a great deal, but would you be willing to help me investigate Price more directly? You could attend social functions where he might be present, perhaps even contrive to make his acquaintance. As a governess to a wealthy family, you would have access to certain events without arousing suspicion." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at the prospect. It was dangerous, certainly, but the thought of finally taking action after months of guilty paralysis was intoxicating. "I'm willing," she said, "but we'll need a credible reason for me to suddenly take an interest in banking circles." James leaned forward, and Eleanor caught the subtle scent of his cologne, something woody and masculine that seemed entirely fitting for him. "The Pembroke family you work for, do they have financial dealings with the Boston Maritime Trust?" "I believe they do," Eleanor confirmed. "Mr. Pembroke has mentioned the bank in passing. He's quite wealthy, made his fortune in textiles." "Then here's what we'll do," James said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I'll arrange for Mr. Pembroke to receive an invitation to an exclusive reception at the bank next week. It's an annual event where the bank's most important clients are wined and dined. The Pembrokes will undoubtedly attend, and you, as their governess, might reasonably accompany Mrs. Pembroke if she needs assistance with the children or simply wants female companionship. That could work, Eleanor agreed, her mind already formulating how she might convince Mrs. Pembroke to bring her along. But what would I do once I'm there? I can hardly march up to Mr. Price and accuse him of murder. A ghost of a smile touched James's lips again, and Eleanor found herself wishing he would smile more often. It transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. No, but you can observe him. Watch how he interacts with others, particularly with Harrison Fletcher. You can listen to conversations, gather information, and if the opportunity presents itself naturally, you might even strike up a conversation with Price himself. Just be careful, Miss Whitmore. If he is our killer, he's extraordinarily dangerous. The gravity in his voice sent a shiver through Eleanor, but she refused to be deterred. I understand the risks, Mr. Brennan. I'll be cautious. James, he said suddenly, if we're to work together on this investigation, perhaps we should dispense with such formality. Please call me James. Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest at this gesture of trust and intimacy. Then you must call me Eleanor. Eleanor, he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. Thank you for this. You can't know what it means to me to have someone believe me, to have help in seeking justice for Elizabeth. I think I can imagine, Eleanor said softly. I lost both my parents to illness when I was 20. The helplessness, the guilt, the desperate need to make their deaths mean something. I understand those feelings, James. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes that spoke of shared pain and understanding. For a moment, the barrier of grief that surrounded him seemed to thin, and Eleanor glimpsed the man he must have been before tragedy had reshaped him. I'm sorry for your loss, he said with genuine feeling. To lose both parents so young must have been devastating. It was, Eleanor acknowledged, but it also made me stronger, taught me to rely on myself. Coming to Boston, making my own way, none of that would have been possible if I hadn't learned that lesson. Sometimes our greatest sorrows forge our greatest strengths. James regarded her with something that might have been admiration. You're quite remarkable, Eleanor Whitmore. Elizabeth would have liked you very much. She had a gift for recognizing quality in people. The mention of his late wife created a moment of awkwardness, and Eleanor quickly redirected the conversation. Tell me more about the bank reception. What should I be looking for, specifically? James seemed grateful for the return to practical matters. Watch for any signs of tension between Price and Fletcher, or between Price and any other bank officials. Elizabeth's letter suggested that multiple people might be involved in the embezzlement. If there's a conspiracy, there might be cracks in the facade, especially at a social event where alcohol loosens tongues. Should we meet beforehand to coordinate our approach? Eleanor asked. Yes, James agreed, but we'll need to be discreet. We can't be seen together too often or people will talk, and word might get back to Price or whoever else is involved. He paused, considering. Do you ever visit the public garden? Sometimes on my afternoons off, Eleanor replied. Then let's meet there this Sunday at 2 o'clock by the pond where Elizabeth was supposed to meet you. We can walk and talk without attracting attention. Just two acquaintances enjoying the autumn weather. Eleanor nodded, already anticipating the meeting with a flutter of something that wasn't entirely related to the investigation. She found herself drawn to James Brennan in ways that surprised her, attracted not just to his striking physical appearance but to his dedication, his intelligence, and the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. They spent the next hour discussing details, with James sharing what he knew about the bank's structure and the key players involved. Eleanor learned that Edmund Price had risen rapidly through the bank's ranks despite being only 32 years old, suggesting either exceptional talent or exceptional cunning. Harrison Fletcher, Elizabeth's father, had been with the bank for 25 years and was universally respected in Boston's financial circles. The bank's president, Nathaniel Morse, was an older gentleman in his 60s who was known more for his social connections than his financial acumen. One more thing, James said as they prepared to leave. The tea room had emptied considerably as evening approached and the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the gas lamps. I want you to have this. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver whistle on a chain. It's a police whistle, he explained. If you ever feel you're in danger, blow it. I've alerted several of my colleagues to listen for it. They'll come running, no questions asked. Eleanor took the whistle, touched by his concern for her safety. Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, and she felt a jolt of electricity at the contact. From the way James's eyes darkened slightly, she suspected he felt it too. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll keep it with me always." They collected their coats and stepped out into the evening air. The streets were less crowded now, and the city had taken on a hushed, intimate quality. James insisted on escorting Eleanor back to the Pembroke residence on Commonwealth Avenue, and she didn't protest. The walk took 20 minutes, and they spent it in comfortable conversation, discussing everything from Eleanor's life in Vermont to James's career in the police force. "I always wanted to be a detective," he confided as they turned onto Commonwealth Avenue with its elegant brownstone mansions. "Even as a boy, I loved solving puzzles, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. My father wanted me to be a lawyer, but I needed to do something more active, more immediate. I wanted to help people, to bring justice to those who had been wronged." "And have you?" Eleanor asked. "Helped people, I mean?" "I'd like to think so," James replied. "I've solved dozens of cases over the past 8 years, put many criminals behind bars. But losing Elizabeth showed me how fragile justice really is, how easily it can be thwarted by wealth and influence." They had reached the Pembroke house, an imposing 4-story brownstone with a wrought iron fence and well-manicured front garden. Eleanor paused at the gate, reluctant for the evening to end, despite the gravity of what they had discussed. "Thank you for walking me home," she said, "and thank you for trusting me with this investigation." "Thank you for believing me," James replied, "and for caring enough about Elizabeth to want to help. Not many people would take such a risk for someone they barely knew." "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that sometimes we're called to help people precisely because we barely knew them. Perhaps that's when we can be most objective, most effective." James smiled, a real smile this time that reached his eyes and made him look younger, less burdened. "You continue to surprise me, Eleanor. I look forward to working with you." "And I you," Eleanor said, feeling her cheeks warm despite the cool evening air. "Until Sunday, then?" "Until Sunday," James confirmed. He tipped his hat to her, and she watched as he walked away down the street, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. Eleanor let herself into the house through the servants' entrance, her mind whirling with everything that had transpired. Mrs. Pembroke, a kind woman in her 40s with 3 energetic children, had given Eleanor the afternoon off, so there would be no questions about where she had been. She made her way up to her small but comfortable room on the 3rd floor and sat on her bed, pulling out the police whistle James had given her. The weight of it in her palm felt like a promise, a connection to him that transcended the investigation. She found herself thinking about the way he had looked at her in the tea room, the flash of warmth in his eyes when he smiled, the protective way he had positioned himself between her and the street traffic. It was inappropriate to have such thoughts about a man so recently widowed, she knew, but she couldn't help the way her heart had responded to him. Over the next few days, Eleanor focused on securing her invitation to the bank reception. Mrs. Pembroke proved remarkably amenable to the idea when Eleanor casually mentioned that she had never attended such an elegant event and would love to see how Boston's finest society conducted themselves. Mrs. Pembroke, who genuinely cared for Eleanor and appreciated her excellent work with the children, immediately insisted that Eleanor accompany her and Mr. Pembroke to the reception. "It will be good for you to see more of the city's social life," Mrs. Pembroke declared, "and I shall enjoy having another lady to talk with. These banking functions can be terribly dull, all those men discussing figures and interest rates." Sunday arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm weather for late October. Eleanor, dressed in her best walking dress, a deep burgundy wool with black trim that she had carefully saved for months to purchase. She told Mrs. Pembroke she was going to visit a friend from her church, which was not entirely untrue since she and James had, in a sense, become friends. The public garden was beautiful in the afternoon light, with the leaves on the trees turning brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. The pond reflected the clear blue sky, and several couples strolled along the paths, enjoying the fine weather. Eleanor found James waiting by the pond exactly where he had said he would be, looking handsome in a dark gray suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame. "Eleanor," he greeted her with obvious pleasure. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, feeling that now familiar flutter in her chest. "Shall we walk?" They began walking along the pond's edge, maintaining a respectable distance that would appear entirely proper to any observers, yet close enough that their quiet conversation remained private. The autumn sun filtered through the trees, dappling the path with light and shadow, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of James's presence beside her. "I have good news," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Pembroke has agreed to bring me to the bank reception on Friday evening. I'll have full access to observe Mr. Price and the other bank officials." "Excellent," James replied, his expression brightening considerably. "I've done some additional investigating this week. I visited several of the establishments where Elizabeth spent her final days, and I discovered something interesting. 2 days before she died, she had lunch at the Parker House Hotel with someone. The waiter remembered her because of her beauty and grace, but he couldn't identify her companion, only that it was a man in his 30s, well-dressed with dark hair. That could describe many men, Eleanor observed, including Edmund Price. "Indeed," James agreed. "But what's particularly interesting is that the waiter said Elizabeth seemed distressed during the lunch. She was agitated, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, and at one point she pulled out a small leather journal and showed her companion something written inside. The man became very serious, even angry, according to the waiter. Shortly after that, they left the restaurant rather abruptly." Eleanor's mind raced with the implications. "Do you think Elizabeth was confronting whoever she suspected of the embezzlement, showing them evidence she had gathered?" "It's possible," James said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "If she was, it was extraordinarily dangerous. She might have signed her own death warrant in that restaurant." "But why would she confront them?" Eleanor asked, puzzled. "Why not simply go to the authorities with what she had discovered?" James was quiet for a moment, guiding Eleanor around a group of children playing near the path. "That's been troubling me as well. The only explanation I can think of is that she cared about the person involved, wanted to give them a chance to explain or make things right before exposing them publicly." "Someone she cared about," Eleanor repeated slowly. "James, what if it was her father? What if Harrison Fletcher is involved in the embezzlement and Elizabeth discovered it? That would explain why she was so conflicted, why she would want to confront him privately first." James's jaw tightened, and Eleanor could see the war of emotions playing across his face. "I've tried not to think about that possibility because it would destroy me to believe that Harrison could have harmed his own daughter. He was devastated by her death, Eleanor. I saw him at the funeral. That grief was real. Grief and guilt can look very similar," Eleanor said gently. "And if he didn't kill her himself, but his actions led to her death, the guilt would be overwhelming." "You're right, of course," James admitted with obvious difficulty. "I've been avoiding this line of investigation because of my personal feelings, but we can't ignore the possibility that Fletcher is involved, either directly or indirectly." They had reached a secluded area of the garden where a bench sat beneath a large oak tree, somewhat hidden from the main paths. James gestured to it, and they sat down, the bench bringing them closer together than propriety would normally allow, but providing the privacy they needed for such sensitive discussion. "There's something else I need to tell you," James said, turning to face Eleanor. In the dappled sunlight, his blue eyes seemed even more intense, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the raw emotion she saw there. "I've been investigating you, Eleanor. Not because I don't trust you, but because I need to understand why Elizabeth chose to reach out to you specifically. There are dozens of women in her social circle she could have confided in, but she chose you, someone she barely knew." Eleanor felt a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. "What did you discover?" "That your father, before he died, worked as a bookkeeper for a manufacturing company in Vermont," James said, "and that he was dismissed from his position 6 months before his death under suspicion of discovering financial irregularities. He tried to report what he had found to the company's board, but they refused to investigate, claiming he was mistaken. The stress of the dismissal and the accusations that followed contributed to his decline in health." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. She had known about her father's dismissal, of course, but hearing it recounted by James, understanding its connection to Elizabeth's situation, brought a fresh wave of grief and anger. "My father was an honest man," she said, her voice trembling. "He would never have stolen anything. When he discovered the irregularities in the accounts, he thought he was doing the right thing by reporting them. Instead, they destroyed his reputation and drove him to an early grave." "I know," James said softly, and to Eleanor's surprise, he reached out and took her hand in his. The touch was comforting and electrifying at once. "I believe Elizabeth knew about your father's situation. She must have heard about it through some connection, realized that you would understand what she was facing, that you had personal experience with the consequences of exposing financial corruption. That's why she trusted you." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. "Then we're both seeking justice for people we loved, who were destroyed by greed and corruption." "Yes," James agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "And together, we will find it." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, united by shared purpose and growing understanding. Eleanor knew she should pull her hand away, that this intimacy was inappropriate, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. James seemed similarly reluctant, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand, in a gesture that seemed unconscious but deeply tender. "The reception is in 5 days," Eleanor finally said, though she made no move to withdraw her hand. "What should I look for specifically?" James seemed to shake himself from his reverie, though he too maintained their handhold. "Several things. First, observe the interactions between Price, Fletcher, and Morse. Look for any signs of tension, any coded exchanges or meaningful glances. Second, if you get a chance to speak with Price directly, try to gauge his character. Is he arrogant? Nervous? Does he seem like a man with something to hide? Third, and this is crucial, try to determine if there's any way to access the bank's private offices during the reception. If we could get into Price's office and examine his records, we might find the evidence we need." "That sounds extremely dangerous," Eleanor observed. "It is," James admitted, "which is why I'm going to be there as well. Not as a police detective, of course, but I'll find a way to gain access to the reception. I'll be watching over you the entire time, Eleanor. If anything seems wrong, if you feel threatened in any way, you leave immediately. Do you understand?" The protective fierceness in his voice made Eleanor's heart race. "I understand. But James, if you're there, won't people recognize you? Won't Harrison Fletcher know you?" "Fletcher and I haven't spoken since he had me removed from investigating the bank," James said. "And I'll be in disguise of sorts. I have contacts who can help with that. I'll be there as a representative from a shipping company, complete with false credentials. No one will recognize me, I promise you." Eleanor found herself smiling, despite the gravity of their situation. "You've thought of everything." "I try," James replied, and there was a hint of warmth in his voice that sent a pleasant shiver through Eleanor. "I can't lose anyone else to this investigation, Eleanor. I won't lose you." The intensity of his words, the implication that she had become important to him beyond her usefulness in the investigation, made Eleanor's pulse quicken. She knew she should discourage such feelings, remind him that he was still in mourning, that any attachment between them was premature at best. But looking into his eyes, seeing the loneliness and need there that surely mirrored her own, she couldn't bring herself to push him away. "You won't lose me," she said firmly. "We're going to solve this together, James. We're going to find out who killed Elizabeth and bring them to justice." "Yes," James agreed. "We will." The days leading up to the reception passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Eleanor found it difficult to focus on her duties with the Pembroke children, her mind constantly returning to the investigation, and, if she was honest with herself, to James. She caught herself thinking about him at odd moments, remembering the way his hand had felt holding hers, the protective concern in his voice, the vulnerability he had shown her. Friday evening arrived with unseasonably warm weather that felt almost like a gift. Eleanor dressed in a gown that Mrs. Pembroke had generously given her, a beautiful creation in deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her eyes and complemented her auburn hair perfectly. Mrs. Pembroke's lady's maid helped arrange Eleanor's hair in an elegant, upswept style, with a few tendrils left to frame her face. "You look absolutely lovely, dear," Mrs. Pembroke said warmly when Eleanor descended to the drawing room where the family was gathering before departure. "Doesn't she, Mr. Pembroke?" Mr. Pembroke, a portly gentleman in his 50s with kind eyes and a jovial disposition, agreed enthusiastically. "Indeed she does. You'll be the belle of the ball, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor blushed at the compliment but thanked them graciously. The Pembroke carriage carried them through the evening streets of Boston to the imposing granite building that housed the Boston Maritime Trust. The bank's facade was illuminated by dozens of gas lamps, giving it an almost magical quality against the darkening sky. Inside, the bank's main hall had been transformed for the reception. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled guests, who were dressed in their finest evening attire. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A small orchestra played soft music in one corner, and the air was filled with the murmur of refined conversation and occasional laughter. Eleanor's eyes immediately began scanning the crowd, looking for both Edmund Price and James in whatever disguise he had adopted. She spotted Price almost immediately standing near the center of the room in conversation with several other men. He was indeed handsome in a smooth, polished way, with dark hair slicked back, a well-trimmed mustache, and expensive evening clothes that fit him perfectly. There was something predatory in the way he surveyed the room, his eyes constantly moving, assessing, calculating. Harrison Fletcher stood nearby, a distinguished man in his late 50s with silver hair and an air of gravitas that commanded respect. Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy watching him. He looked older than his years, with deep lines of grief etched around his eyes and mouth. If he was involved in his daughter's death, the guilt was clearly destroying him. "Eleanor, dear, would you like some champagne?" Mrs. Pembroke asked, drawing Eleanor's attention. "Yes, thank you," Eleanor replied, accepting a glass from a passing waiter. She used the opportunity to continue scanning the room, searching for James. She found him standing near a group of men by the windows, and she had to suppress a gasp of recognition. He had transformed himself remarkably. His hair was styled differently, parted on the opposite side and lightened slightly with some kind of powder. He wore spectacles with thin gold frames that changed the shape of his face, and a false mustache that was so expertly applied it looked entirely natural. He was dressed in a slightly less fashionable suit than the other guests, giving him the appearance of a successful but not wealthy businessman. If she hadn't known to look for him, she might never have recognized him. As if sensing her gaze, James looked up and their eyes met across the room. Even through the disguise, Eleanor could see the intensity in his blue eyes, the silent message of support and protection. He gave the slightest nod, acknowledging her presence, before turning back to his conversation. "Miss Whitmore, allow me to introduce you to some of our hosts," Mr. Pembroke said, guiding Eleanor toward a group that included Edmund Price and Harrison Fletcher. Eleanor's heart began to pound, but she kept her expression pleasant and composed. "Gentlemen, may I present Miss Eleanor Whitmore, governess to my children and a delightful young lady," Mr. Pembroke announced. "Miss Whitmore, this is Mr. Edmund Price, assistant manager of the bank, and Mr. Harrison Fletcher, vice president." "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Whitmore," Price said smoothly, taking her hand and bowing over it. His grip was firm but not warm, and his eyes assessed her with the same calculating interest she had noticed earlier. "A governess, you say? How fascinating. You must be quite accomplished to have earned such a position with a family as distinguished as the Pembrokes." "You're very kind, Mr. Price," Eleanor replied, carefully extracting her hand. "I simply try to do my best for the children entrusted to my care." "Admirable," Price murmured, though his attention had already begun to drift to other guests. Harrison Fletcher, however, regarded Eleanor with more genuine interest. "Whitmore," he repeated thoughtfully.
"Are you perhaps related to the Whitmore family of Vermont? I believe there was a gentleman by that name who worked in accounting there." Eleanor felt her heart skip, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, that was my father." "Did you know him, Mr. Fletcher?" "Only by reputation," Fletcher replied, and something passed across his face. Was it guilt? Sympathy? Eleanor couldn't quite read it. "I was sorry to hear of his passing. He had a reputation as an honest and thorough bookkeeper." "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. "That means a great deal to hear." An awkward silence fell, which Mr. Pembroke quickly filled with commentary about the bank's impressive architecture. Eleanor used the opportunity to observe the dynamics between Fletcher and Price. There was definitely tension there, she realized. Fletcher barely looked at Price, and when he did, there was something cold and disapproving in his expression. Price, for his part, seemed to regard Fletcher with a mixture of wariness and barely concealed contempt. The evening progressed with Eleanor circulating through the crowd with Mrs. Pembroke, engaging in polite conversation while keeping a careful watch on both Price and Fletcher. She noticed that Price spoke with many guests, but kept glancing toward a hallway that led to the bank's private offices. Twice he disappeared down that hallway, returning after 10 or 15 minutes each time. Around 9 o'clock, Eleanor saw her opportunity. Price had just excused himself and headed toward the private offices once again.
She caught James's eye across the room and gave a subtle nod toward the hallway. He understood immediately, making his own excuses and positioning himself where he could observe the corridor's entrance. "Mrs. Pembroke, would you excuse me for a moment?" Eleanor asked. "I'm afraid I need to find the ladies' retiring room." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Pembroke replied. "I believe it's down that hallway to the left." Eleanor made her way toward the hallway, her heart pounding. She had memorized the basic layout of the bank from descriptions James had provided, and she knew that Price's office was on the second floor, accessed by a staircase at the end of this very corridor. She walked past the ladies' room and toward the staircase, praying she wouldn't encounter anyone. The staircase was dimly lit, and Eleanor lifted her skirts to climb it as quietly as possible. At the top, she found herself in a long hallway lined with doors, each bearing a brass nameplate. She moved quickly but carefully, reading each name until she found the one she sought. Edmund Price, assistant manager. The door was locked, but Eleanor had come prepared. James had given her a set of lockpicks, along with quick instructions on how to use them. Her hands trembled as she inserted the picks into the lock, but she forced herself to remain calm and focused. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, she heard the satisfying click of the lock opening. She slipped inside the office and closed the door behind her, her heart racing so fast she felt dizzy. The office was neat and orderly, with a large desk, filing cabinets, and bookshelves filled with ledgers. A window overlooked the street, and moonlight streamed in, providing just enough illumination for Eleanor to see without lighting a lamp. She moved to the desk and began carefully examining the papers scattered across its surface. Most were routine bank documents, nothing incriminating. She tried the desk drawers, but they were locked. She was reaching for her lockpicks again when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Eleanor froze, her mind racing. There was nowhere to hide in the small office except behind the door itself or under the desk. She chose the latter, scrambling beneath it just as the office door opened and the lights came on. From her cramped position, Eleanor could see 2 pairs of legs enter the room. One set of legs she recognized from the expensive shoes and trousers as belonging to Edmund Price. The other set was older, the gait more careful and measured. Harrison Fletcher. "We need to talk, Edmund," Fletcher said, his voice strained and weary. "This has gone on long enough. I know what you've been doing, and it ends now." "I don't know what you're talking about, Harrison," Price replied smoothly, though Eleanor detected an edge of tension in his voice. "If you have some concern about bank operations, we can discuss it during business hours with proper documentation." "Don't play games with me," Fletcher snapped, and Eleanor heard the sound of papers being slammed onto the desk above her. "I have the evidence, Edmund. All of it. Every falsified entry, every redirected payment, every fraudulent account. I know you've been embezzling from the bank for years, and I know the total is well over $200,000. There was a long, terrible silence. Eleanor hardly dared to breathe, terrified that the slightest movement would give away her presence. "Did Elizabeth help you gather this evidence?" Price finally asked, his voice now devoid of all pretense of friendliness. It had become cold, dangerous. "Is that what she was doing before she died?" "Leave my daughter out of this," Fletcher said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She's gone, and nothing can bring her back. But I can still stop you from destroying more lives, from stealing from people who trusted this institution. Your daughter was a nosy, self-righteous fool," Price spat. "Just like you're being now. She didn't understand the complexities of modern finance, the need for creative accounting to maximize returns. She threatened everything I had built." "You killed her," Fletcher said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of devastated certainty. "My God, Edmund, you killed my Elizabeth. How did you do it? How did you murder my daughter?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. She was hearing a confession, but she was also trapped in a room with a murderer who had already killed once to protect his secrets. "I didn't kill her," Price said, and Eleanor heard genuine anger in his voice. "I would never have harmed Elizabeth directly, but I knew she was investigating me, knew she had gathered evidence. I went to see her that afternoon before she died, told her that if she exposed me, it would destroy not just me but the entire bank, including your reputation, Harrison." "I thought I had convinced her to keep quiet." "Then how did she die?" Fletcher demanded. "The doctor said heart failure, but I've never believed that. She was perfectly healthy." "I don't know," Price said, and for the first time, Eleanor heard what might have been genuine confusion in his voice. "I swear to you, Harrison, I don't know. When I heard she had died, I was as shocked as anyone. I thought perhaps the stress of what she had discovered had affected her heart, but you don't believe that any more than I do, Fletcher finished grimly. Someone else knew what Elizabeth had discovered. Someone who decided she was too dangerous to live. Who else knew about your embezzlement, Edmund? Price was quiet for a long moment. Nathaniel knew, he finally admitted. Nathaniel Morse, our esteemed bank president. He's been my partner from the beginning, Harrison. How do you think I managed to access so many accounts, to manipulate so many records without being detected? Nathaniel provided the cover and the authorization. Nathaniel, Fletcher breathed, and Eleanor could hear the horror in his voice. Dear God, he's known Eliza since she was a child. He was at our home for dinner just days before she died. He brought her a gift, Price said quietly. I remember because I was there too, at a small gathering you hosted. He brought her a tin of special tea, said it was from China, very rare and expensive. Elizabeth was delighted. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt ice flood her veins as the pieces fell into place. The tea, the bitter smell James had noticed. Nathaniel Morse had poisoned Elizabeth with a gift of tea, something she would never have suspected, something that would be prepared and consumed in the privacy of her own home. He poisoned her, Fletcher said, his voice hollow with shock and grief. With the tea. That's how he did it. And I thanked him for his thoughtfulness. I watched my daughter accept that gift and never suspected. His voice broke completely, and Eleanor heard what might have been sobs. Price said nothing, and the silence stretched on, heavy with guilt and horror. We have to go to the police, Fletcher finally said. We have to tell them everything. Nathaniel must be arrested, charged with Elizabeth's murder. Think about what you're saying, Harrison, Price urged. If you expose Nathaniel, you expose me, and you expose the bank's vulnerabilities. The scandal will destroy the institution your father helped build. Depositors will panic. There will be a run on the bank. Hundreds of innocent people will lose their savings. I don't care, Fletcher said fiercely. My daughter's life is worth more than any bank. Her murderer will face justice no matter the cost. Then you're a fool, Price said coldly, and you leave me no choice. Eleanor heard a sudden scuffle above her, then a heavy thud. She bit back a scream as she saw Fletcher's body collapse to the floor beside the desk, blood pooling from a wound in his head. Price stood over him, holding a heavy brass candlestick that was now stained with blood. I'm sorry, Harrison, Price said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. But I can't let you destroy everything I've worked for. 2 deaths to cover up embezzlement is unfortunate, but necessary. Eleanor's mind raced in panic. Price thought Fletcher was dead, but she could see the older man's chest still rising and falling shallowly. He was alive but unconscious and grievously injured, and Eleanor was trapped in the room with his attacker, with no way to call for help and no way to escape. Price moved away from Fletcher's body, and Eleanor heard him rummaging through the filing cabinets, presumably searching for the evidence Fletcher had mentioned. This was her only chance. She carefully, silently began to inch out from under the desk, praying that Price was too distracted to notice. Her hand found the police whistle on its chain around her neck, the whistle James had given her for exactly this kind of emergency. She was halfway out from under the desk when her skirt caught on the desk leg, making a soft rustling sound. Price spun around immediately, his eyes widening in shock when he saw her. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice dangerous. What an unexpected surprise. How much did you hear? Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she brought the whistle to her lips and blew as hard as she could. The piercing shriek of the whistle cut through the night, impossibly loud in the confined space. Price lunged toward her, but Eleanor was already moving, scrambling to her feet and running for the door. She wrenched it open and nearly collided with James, who was racing up the stairs, his disguise abandoned, his police badge gleaming on his chest. Behind him were 3 other police officers, all responding to the whistle's call. Eleanor? James caught her as she stumbled, his arms wrapping around her protectively. Are you hurt? Fletcher, she gasped. He's in the office, wounded. Price hit him with a candlestick. And James, we know who killed Elizabeth. It was Nathaniel Morse. He poisoned her with tea. James's eyes blazed with a mixture of relief that Eleanor was safe and fury at what she had revealed. He released her into the care of one of the other officers and stormed into the office with his colleagues. Eleanor heard Price shouting protests and denials, heard the click of handcuffs, and then James emerged, supporting a barely conscious Harrison Fletcher. "Get a doctor immediately," James ordered, "and send men to arrest Nathaniel Morse at his home. Charge him with the murder of Elizabeth Brennan." The next hours passed in a blur. More police arrived, statements were taken, and Fletcher was rushed to the hospital. Eleanor found herself in a small office, wrapped in a blanket someone had provided, giving her account to a senior detective while James stood nearby, refusing to leave her side. By midnight, the truth was fully revealed. Confronted with the evidence Fletcher had gathered and Eleanor's testimony of Price's confession, Edmund Price had broken down completely and confirmed everything. Nathaniel Morse had been arrested at his home, where a search had revealed a cache of exotic poisons, including the same Chinese toxin he had used to poison Elizabeth's tea. The poison was rare and slow-acting, designed to mimic the symptoms of heart failure. Morse had killed Elizabeth when Price warned him that she was close to exposing their embezzlement scheme. Harrison Fletcher survived his injury, though he faced a long recovery. In the days following the arrests, he provided authorities with comprehensive evidence of the embezzlement, ensuring that both Price and Morse would face justice not just for Elizabeth's murder, but for their theft from the bank and its depositors. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood once more at Elizabeth's grave, laying white roses against the headstone. But this time she wasn't alone. James stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort and growing affection. "She would be proud of what you did," James said softly. "You gave her justice when no one else would believe she deserved it." "We gave her justice," Eleanor corrected, looking up at him. "We did it together." James smiled, that warm, genuine smile that Eleanor had come to treasure. Over the past weeks, as they had navigated the aftermath of the case, their connection had deepened into something neither of them could deny. They had spent hours together, talking, sharing their grief and their hopes, slowly building something new from the ashes of tragedy. "Eleanor," James said, taking both her hands in his, "I know it hasn't been very long since Elizabeth died, and I know some people would say this is too soon, but I also know that life is precious and uncertain, and we should treasure happiness when we find it. You brought light back into my darkness. You gave me purpose again, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion. "I love you too, James. I think I started falling for you that first day in the cemetery, when I saw how much you cared about finding the truth. These past weeks, working with you, getting to know you, it's shown me that sometimes the greatest loves grow from shared purpose and mutual respect." "Marry me," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday soon. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy, protecting you, loving you the way you deserve to be loved." "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you, James Brennan." He pulled her into his arms, and there, beside Elizabeth's grave, he kissed her with a tenderness and passion that promised a lifetime of love. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "Elizabeth would want this," Eleanor said softly. "She would want you to be happy again, to find love again." "I know," James agreed, "and I think she might have planned it this way, in her own way. She brought you into my life, Eleanor, through her death, but also through her final actions. She trusted you, and that trust gave us the chance to find each other." They stood together for a few more moments, honoring Elizabeth's memory, before turning to walk back toward the cemetery gates hand in hand. The autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the future that had seemed so dark just weeks ago now glowed with promise. 6 months later, on a beautiful spring morning, Eleanor and James were married in a small church ceremony, attended by close friends and family, including Harrison Fletcher, who had recovered from his injuries and had become a father figure to Eleanor. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives, both felt the presence of Elizabeth, blessing their union and rejoicing in the happiness they had found together. Justice had been served, love had triumphed over tragedy, and 2 wounded souls had found healing and joy in each other's arms. The mystery that had brought them together had been solved, but the love story it had sparked would continue for all the years to come, a testament to the truth that even in the darkest moments, hope and happiness can be found if we're brave enough to reach for them.